Hi. I hope spring break was somewhat restful and enjoyable for you. You even had an extra week there, so if you have not, please remember that your annotated bibliography is due. Let me just go ahead and get a couple of things out of the way. This is still new for me, so I'm working through this. Our course, Current Moral and Social Issues, is really a course that lends itself more to lots of discussion. You know that you've been with me for half the semester. You know that that's how I operate. Um, that is to say that I try to weave in a little bit of lecture with the discussion. So what I'm going to do here today is this is going to be the lecture part all together. And we're starting the topic of sexual issues. We'll be looking at sex. We'll be looking at marriage. We'll be looking at abortion. We'll be looking at same-sex, gender identity, and maybe even get into a little bit of Me Too stuff. I've uploaded a number of videos for you to look at, so please do take a moment and view those. Not a moment, you know that I use videos, so it'll take you a few minutes to go through most of those. You don't have to do it today. We're going to be on this unit of sexual issues for a couple of weeks. So I'll give you about half the class today, and then next Tuesday I'll upload the other half of class so that you can view it at your leisure. I've also put up there on Canvas 3 articles. Those 3 articles, one is from Pope Paul the Sixth. Yes, Pope Paul the Sixth, Humane Vitae on human life. It's the Roman Catholic Church's official position on human life and contraception and other issues like that. So I encourage you to read it. It is a little dense to get through. But that article is there. I put up another article. It's actually 2 articles from a book called Choices. And those 2 articles deal with, give me just one moment. Now I'll tell you exactly what the titles are. Should abortions late in pregnancy be banned? So sometimes the term is used, late-term abortion. So this looks at it from both a pro and a con perspective. So take time to read that. And then the second one that's in that section, in that entry for that article, is should pregnant women be punished for exposing fetuses to risk? So there we're talking about things like smoking, taking drugs that are not approved. So please do take a moment. It looks like it's from one book, so it takes perspectives on both sides of the issue. It doesn't decide on the issue itself. It allows you to make a decision on that issue, but it presents you with all the facts, much like the website procon.org does. So please do take time to read that. And then the final article, the third article that I put up there, is a chapter from a book. It's a feminist perspective, and it talks about abortion as a sacrifice to Artemis. And so it was quite controversial a few years back. So it is a little difficult to get through for some people, but I present it to you because it is a perspective that I hope that you will understand. Artemis being one of the ancient Greco-Roman gods, I believe it is, if I'm remembering correctly, and makes the argument of why abortion might be acceptable under certain circumstances as a religious act. So it's somewhat controversial there. So in addition to those 3 articles that I posted on Canvas, you also have several discussion questions. Now, what I expect you to do is once you've listened to part of this lecture, you can go in and you can and watch some of the clips that I put out there, and also gotten into the articles. I also gave you some chapters from your textbook to read as well. So please do take note of those. So once you've kind of gotten into this material, my expectation is that you will jump on those discussion questions and you'll begin to post some comments. And this is your class participation. So this is especially good for those people who weren't comfortable with class participation. This gives you an opportunity to sit down and type your ideas on these various topics. I gave you a number of things there. What is sex? What type of sex qualifies as sex? I ask you to please be mature in your response to that. I'm not looking for childish responses to that. Please be mature. Think about those questions. Ask you questions about sex education and other things like that. So please do take some time, look over those questions, and give me some thoughtful feedback. You're welcome to reply more than once. You're not limited to one reply. In fact, the more you reply, the more I know that you would be speaking up in class. You can actually reply to other people, I believe, is the way I have it set up as well. So please do, take the opportunity to do that. Now, one other thing that I want to say has to do with your class presentations. We have, at present, after this week, I think we have 6 more weeks of class. I don't have the calendar right in front of me, but I think we have about 6 more weeks of class. So in the next week or two, I'm going to be asking you to think about dates that work with your schedule. I know some of you, you're juggling other classes right now. You might also, I don't know what kind of job you have. You might be juggling a job. You might have all the time in the world right now, and you say like, hey, I want to get this over with. But your class presentation, ordinarily this would obviously have been done in front of everyone. We don't have the ability to do that right now. So what I'm offering you is you will schedule a time that you will either FaceTime, Zoom with me, WebEx, whatever you want to use, whatever you're familiar with, we can do it that way. If you Skype, I haven't Skyped in forever, but I do know have Zoom, FaceTime, other things like that. And so we can set up an opportunity for you to do your presentation. This doesn't have to be long. This needs to be exactly what you would have presented in class. So if you would have used props, bring your props. If there's, I'm not looking for a PowerPoint presentation. Quick story. The second time I went to Southeast Asia, the first time I was on a study tour, the second time I went back, and I was one of the presenters at a conference there. And there were like 15 of us presenting over a couple of days in Bangkok. And everybody, absolutely everybody had a PowerPoint presentation. And I happened to be the last person presented. And after 2 days of looking at PowerPoint, people were absolutely, their eyes were glazed over. They didn't want to see any more PowerPoint presentations. So I got up and I gave out a handout and simply talked about what was in the handout. And it was the most well-received presentation. I'm not saying that to bring any recognition to me. I'm just saying you don't have to do a PowerPoint to give a good presentation. So however you want to do that, you're welcome to do that. It doesn't have to be long. We're looking for about 5 minutes at the most. Since we're able to do it this way, this certainly gives you the opportunity to do a good presentation that will be a one-on-one between us, unless something changes and we're back by the end of the semester. It's not looking like that's going to happen. Right now you have everything on Canvas that you need to get started on this section on sexual issues, the topic of sexual issues. And so with that, we're going to jump into this kind of with both feet now. So let me just begin by telling you. In fact, I mentioned when I was in Southeast Asia. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience there, and then I'll back up and begin to give you some things to think about. So the first time I went to Southeast Asia, we spent quite a bit of time in Bangkok. And it was a religious study tour. We were engaging with religious and civil authorities, government officials. This was in the mid 2000s. 2005, I think, was the first time, and it was about 5 years later, 2010, when I went back to the second time. But I was with a group of young religious leaders. And we were studying the intersection of religion and civil society. And so we had a couple of Buddhists in the group, we had a Muslim in the group, we had a Jain in the group, and there were three Christians, all three different types of Christians, a Roman Catholic, a Southern Baptist, and myself. I guess I just revealed that part, didn't I? Well, you already knew that. The interesting thing about this was I was the only male in the group. So all the other representatives of their religions, they were women. That's, by the way, when I was made an honorary woman. That's a whole nother story. But we were encouraged to explore the culture of Bangkok and to get to know the culture a little bit, in addition to the meetings and conferences that we're going to during the day. So in Bangkok, they have a huge night market. It's just absolutely just crazy, a little bit of everything that goes on in the night market. So anyway, I don't want to digress too much of that. But two of the women in the group, they had heard about a particular bar in Bangkok known as Telephone, and it was a place where older men would go and meet and hook up with boys underage. And so they wanted to go and see what the bar was like and experience the bar. And so they were a little bit afraid to go by themselves, but they wanted to go. So they asked me if I would go with them. And so I agreed. And we went to the bar called Telephone. And we got there and we noticed a number of Western men. They were as white as me. Some were from Australia, some were from obviously other parts of the country. We know that some of them were from Australia for various reasons. But they were from all over the world, and they were white men, and they were older. The majority of them were definitely, I would say, 40 and beyond, some into their 60s and maybe even older. And they were with much younger looking, I would classify them as boys. And they were young Thai boys. Some of them were very effeminate looking, but not all of them. And we thought that it would be wise to try to document this experience. We were asked to engage with the culture. And so we thought it would be good to document this experience. And so I told them, I said, well, we're here, we're seeing it. Why don't we see if we can take some photos? And this was back in the days where no one really had cameras on their phones. So we still had cameras. And so I asked them to put their arms around each other and lean over. And I said, I will act like I'm taking a photograph of you, but I will zoom in on what's behind you so that we can get some of those images of those older men with the young boys. We just wanted it, again, this was a study tour. We were there to study the culture, the religion. So we just wanted to document our experience in some way. And what I noticed, and they had this experience as well, because we tried to switch around and do the photos, is that in whichever direction we would point the camera, the Western man would not hide his face, but the boys, they definitely looked like they were quite young, 10, 11, 12. The oldest would have been, I would say, mid-teens, 14, 15. The boys would hide their faces, uh, even though they didn't know that I was taking a photo of them. I mean, it wasn't that obvious, but they did not want to be photographed. And so they would hide their face. And so we began to explore this, and it is um, quite a large part of the economy there that Western men go to engage in sex with underage boys. It's well known, and we were there to try to document that. And unfortunately, we were not able to get a number of photographs. Although I do have photographs where you can see the boy hiding his face so that he could not be identified. Well, the next night, I had heard about the clubs. In fact, when we were leaving the bar, I heard about some of the clubs, and I wanted to go out and experience some of the clubs. Um, they weren't really strip clubs, to be honest with you. There were women there, and they were wearing something similar. Most of them were wearing a white one-piece bathing suit, is the way that I would describe it. And in this instance, the women who were on the study tour, they wouldn't go with me. They were afraid to go because of being women going into a club like that. And so I had heard about these clubs, and so I wanted to experience what the clubs were like. So I went into one of the clubs. It was there outside the night market. And what can I say? I sat down, I ordered a drink, and one of the women, very attractive, came and sat on one side of me, and a less attractive woman. I think I'm being objective here because I later found out that this was a method that they would do. Um, so came and sat down on the other side of me. And both of them began to aggressively touch me and rub my body, rub my legs and my chest and my shoulders and play with my hair. And I have to tell you, I began to freak out. Um, so in the course of this, I was there for probably 20, 30 minutes with this going on. They asked if I would buy them a drink. So I agreed I would buy them a drink. And I found out later that probably it was not a drink. There was nothing, no alcohol in it. It was probably just a Coke, a Pepsi, or something like that in their glass. But it was not long. So after about 20 minutes, that the more attractive of the two began to ask me if I wanted to go in the back, if I wanted to go to the back, and I I was really starting to freak out at this point. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. And she began to tell me how much it would be for me to go in the back with her. And not lying, I actually said, yeah, but I don't have any cash. Let me go find an ATM. And yes, they did speak English. They were quite fluent in English. I said, let me go find an ATM and I'll be right back. And I ran out of there like a rabbit, and made my way back to the hotel. I wrote up the whole experience, and journaled the whole thing. The next day, we loaded up to go to whatever conference or engagement we had that day. And I was telling, because we were still talking about telephone the night before, and I was telling them about this. And I began to learn, and we began to learn, that many of these women are held there against their will, that probably, possibly, I got them into major trouble because I was her mark, and I was the John for the evening. And if she came back to her pimp without having income, she might be in trouble, and she had wasted, half an hour or maybe even more if she waited on me after I left. And so that was really driven home to me. I don't remember if it was that day or another day, we went to a detention center in Bangkok, and we were not allowed to take photographs inside. This was an official Bangkok government detention center, and a number of the individuals who were in the detention center, we went into the women's block of the detention center, and there were a number of women. They were from other parts of Southeast Asia, so they were Malaysian, Vietnamese, from China, from other parts of Asia, and they had been brought there. There were actually some very white-looking women, not just Southeast Asian-looking, and we found out that they were from other parts of Central Asia, and many of them had been brought there against their will for sex trafficking. And the point really hit me at that point or the fact really hit me at that point that perhaps the two women who had propositioned me when I was in that club, perhaps they were trafficked. So just like the young boys, women at Telephone, just like the young boys at Telephone, there were women there who were being trafficked and abused and used against their will and against the law. And so I tell you that as an entree into to begin to think about and talk about sexual issues and how we think about sexual issues and all that's wrapped up with it. The U.S. has a complicated history with sex, so at some point we will talk about the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, and I'll say more about that. But to just tell you a couple of other things that have happened in recent years, to tell you, right now everyone is afraid of the coronavirus or COVID-19. In the late 70s, very early 1980s, there was another virus that was going around that was causing quite a scare throughout the United States and literally around the world. And that was HIV/AIDS, as it was later be known. And so there was this fear that no one knew how it was spread, no one knew what caused it, and eventually stories were told about it being a disease of homosexuals. And so there was a lot of prejudice and a lot of violence directed toward same-sex couples because it seemed that was what was causing or where the virus was originating. But then people knew that it was spreading to the blood supply. They knew that heterosexual people were getting it. And so it was really frightening, especially once it was determined that the primary way that AIDS or HIV was spread was through sexual intercourse. It could be spread heterosexually and homosexually. And so that was quite shocking for a lot of people. And it really was difficult for a lot of folks to deal with, especially throughout the 80s, because the government really didn't want to deal with it. Another sexual thing happened in the 1980s as well, that stuck in our national consciousness, if you will, and that was in the latter part of the 1980s. I would say 86 to 89. There were some prominent televangelists. Names that you wouldn't know now, most likely, but in the 70s and 80s, they were well-known names like Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart. Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart, two separate Christian televangelists. They were found to be engaged in affairs. Jim Bakker was having an affair with his secretary, I believe it was. He eventually went to prison for embezzlement, or I forget exactly what he went to prison for. He went to prison. He's actually out and back on television nowadays. He's selling some cure for the coronavirus or something like that the government I know the state of New York told him he has to stop. Um, but part of his downfall was not just the financial stuff, but it was that he was also found out to be engaging in sex with his secretary. His secretary, interestingly enough, went on to pose in Playboy. And then the second one, Jimmy Swaggart, he also was caught soliciting prostitutes in New Orleans. He was from Baton Rouge. He was caught soliciting prostitutes in New Orleans. And he was pulled over later. So after this, and he was pulled over later and found to have all sorts of pornographic material in his car. He was leaving New Orleans, I believe, at that point, or something like that, when the police pulled him over. So that sexual scandal kind of rocked the nation. Not that so many people were following them, although a number of people were, but it was that these prominent Christian televangelists, they were caught in the midst of their hypocrisy, if you will, because Jimmy Swaggart especially was known for preaching against fornication and sexual immorality, as he would call it. Well, fast forward another 10 years, the late 1990s, so this would be right before many of you were born, and there was yet another sexual scandal in the news. And this featured the President of the United States. Bill Clinton was the president at the time. And in the late 90s, there was an investigation that was authorized by the Congress of the United States. And ultimately, Bill Clinton was he was found guilty of lying to the FBI, I believe it was. He lost his law license because he lied under oath, and it was proven that he lied under oath. And what was the big thing that he lied about? He lied about having sex, fellatio, while he was in the Oval Office. That's, for those of you who are trying to look that up, that's a blowjob. And so he had an intern by the name of Monica Lewinsky, who gave him oral sex in the Oval Office of the White House. And this turned into a national scandal. And of course, there were people who would cover their children's ears anytime Bill Clinton would come on television, and they would turn the television off because they didn't want to see him because they thought he was horribly immoral. Well, what happened as a result of that, interestingly enough, is that soon thereafter, there were reports of younger students, school-age students. There was a marked increase in the number of them having oral sex. In fact, there were certain diseases that were starting to spread among a number of school-age students, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and things like that. And the students had heard about Bill Clinton, and he had said it wasn't sex, or it depends on what you define as sex, to say that oral sex was not sex. And so therefore they thought it was perfectly fine as young students, if they could convince someone to give them oral sex or to offer oral sex, that they would do it. And of course, sex is everywhere in our culture. Nowadays you just turn on the television and we're inundated with sexual images. And so it's with that in mind that we began this unit on sexual ethics. What is acceptable? And so, there's some questions that I raise, that some of them are posted there, some of them aren't. But what is sex? What do you define as sex? It's not what I define, it's what you define as sex that's important, in this. What type of sex is considered sex? Does it have to be male to female intercourse? Is it male to male? Is it female to female? Is it oral sex? Is it anal sex? Is it masturbation? They're actually, speaking of Bill Clinton, his Surgeon General, Jocelyn Elders, I think was her name, got in trouble because she made a statement when she was Surgeon General of the United States saying that we've taught young people what to do in the front seat of their car. It's time we teach them what to do in the back seat of the car. And she was advocating that young people learn to mutually masturbate rather than have sex. And she eventually had to resign her job because she was advocating for that. So, what is sex? How do you define sex? What would qualify as having sex? In the famous words of Seinfeld, Elaine asked Jerry, when do you know you've had sex? And Jerry said, I think when the nipple makes an appearance. Well, I don't know. But that's something that I'm asking you to think about and you to define in the course of this, defining for yourself. There are other questions that we should consider in addition to what is sex and what type of sex qualifies. When should one, for example, if one has a sexual disease, a sexually transmitted disease, it doesn't have to be HIV or AIDS. It can be some other STD. STD is a sexually transmitted disease. And so it can be any other, gonorrhea. It can be as I don't want to say as simple, but it can even be something like what we, call crabs. Anything like that. At what point do you tell your sexual partner? Is it before the sex? Is it during the act? Is it afterward when you say, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you? Would that be moral to withhold that information or to give that information after the fact? When is it appropriate to disclose if there's sexual dysfunction? Is that something that needs to be disclosed in some way? Or fetishes, is that something that's appropriate to disclose? And when should one disclose that information to a potential sexual partner or to a sexual partner? Do you ask? Is it appropriate to ask things like, is it moral? I know this sounds strange, but is it moral to ask about someone's sexual history before you engage in sex with them? Or once you have engaged or you begin to engage in sex with them, is it right to ask about their sexual history? Should you know that? Should you know that whether or not they've engaged in safe sex in the past, or if they've engaged in reckless behavior? Just when should you have a conversation about sex? With someone, with a potential sexual partner. All of these questions. And then a broader, more general question might be, what sexual behavior, what sexual acts would be considered moral or immoral? Are there sexual acts that are considered immoral? Certainly, some people would believe that sex prior to being married would be immoral. There are a number of people, most of them for religious reasons, do believe that sex prior to marriage would be immoral. And so that others, however, they see virtually no limits on sexual behavior. There is a couple of authors, and I don't believe they're in anything that you have there, by the name of Goldman and Primerorts. I can't read my own handwriting here. They have said, and this is a quote for them, you have to weigh whether you would agree with this or not. They have said that the sexual act cannot be immoral because it is sex. But it can be immoral if it violates moral principles and rules, such as autonomy, beneficence, or non-maleficence. So let me repeat that. So this is what they've said. Let's see if I have it. I have the name written. I have it written somewhere. We'll go with it anyway. So they have said the sexual act cannot be immoral because it is sex, but it can be immoral if it violates moral principles and rules, such as autonomy, beneficence, and so on and so forth, those terms that we've talked about. You have to weigh that for yourself, because some people would say, no, the sexual act can be immoral if it's engaged in, some would say homosexuality, for example, would be immoral sex. Others would, as I mentioned, some would say that sex outside of marriage would be immoral. I don't know. This is something that I'm asking you to wrestle with. You could also ask the question about, for example, sex with an animal. Is that immoral? Can the animal consent to something like that? Is there a difference between the animal giving or receiving? I know you might want to laugh about that a little bit, but it nevertheless is is something to consider when we're talking about sex. So it's here that I want to back up and begin to talk about some of the history of sex from a Western, primarily a Western theological, philosophical perspective, and give you a little bit of the history of why some of the prohibitions and some of the ideas that have been handed down to many of us through the years have come to be. And there is one person that I want to focus in on. I've mentioned him before. He is commonly known as St. Augustine. So St. Augustine is largely credited with coining the idea of original sin. So what is original sin, and where did that come from? So St. Augustine, in his early life, was of his own admission, was quite the womanizer. He enjoyed the company of women, and he liked to party. He liked to have a good time. And so as a young man, enjoying life, having a good time, he had a number of sexual partners. He did father a child with a woman he never married. But it was during this part of his life that he was not living as a Christian. So he eventually did convert to Christianity. His father was not a Christian. His mother was a Christian. And so he eventually did convert to Christianity. Now, Augustine had trained and had spent most of his life studying classical philosophy. And he went on to be a schoolmaster. He never was, at least at this point in his life, he never was able to give himself entirely over to the study of philosophy and teaching philosophy, which was his passion. But after he converted to Christianity, he soon became a priest and then eventually a bishop. And he did give himself to study of theology and teaching theology and writing theology. And one of the things that he wrote on is a term called original sin. Original sin. If I had a blackboard right now, I'd write that up on the board. Original sin. Now, original sin, you have to back up, and you have to. I don't know how much of this context that you have, but we need to go back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, the book of Genesis, and in the book of Genesis there is a story of Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve were created by God. I'm going to give you the thumbnail sketch of the story. They were created by God. They were placed into the Garden of Eden, and while they were there in the Garden of Eden, they were allowed to do anything they wanted, whatever they wanted to do, except there was one tree in the midst of the Garden of Eden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in the story, whether you take it literally, whether you take it as a metaphor, whether you take it however you want to take it, an allegory, however you want to take it, it doesn't really matter to me. In the story, God had told them, you can eat any tree in this garden that you want to, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's be clear here, this is not a religion class, but let me just remind you, there's nowhere where it says it was an apple. The fruit is the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which leads many people to believe this is better understood as an allegory, a primal myth, than something that should be taken literally. Well, anyway, so it just so happened that one day that a snake told Eve, hey, you know what? This looks like pretty good fruit. You should try it. And Eve said, yeah, you know what? It does look pretty good. So she tried it. She liked the fruit. She gave it to her husband, Adam. He ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil as well. And it's at that point, the Bible tells us in the story that both of their eyes were opened, and that they realized immediately that they were naked. Now that's important for St. Augustine, that they realized that they were naked. In fact, they tried to sew fig leaves together, according to the story, to cover their nakedness. And when God came down to walk in the garden and to have a conversation with them, as God did every day, God looked around for them and could not find them and said, where are you, Adam? Where are you, Eve? And they said, here, we're hiding. God says, why are you hiding? And they say, because we are naked. And so St. Augustine catches on to this sense of nudity, and he immediately connects it with another verse of Scripture that he remembered reading in another part of the Bible, where it says that in sin I was conceived, and in sin I was born. In sin my mother conceived me, and in sin I was born. And so St. Augustine then begins to think about this. The other part that's interesting is that when God casts Adam and Eve, and this whole story, by the way, is referred to as the fall of humanity, F-A-L-L, the fall. And if you were in my intro to philosophy course, I would explain to you that your understanding, St. Augustine's understanding, was that everything was created perfect, and up here it was created by God, it was perfect, and because of decay, entropy, that it begins to decay and fall down. And so the fall then of humanity. So St. Augustine notices also that when God casts Adam and Eve out of this perfect garden, this perfect place, that the man's curse is that he has to work for a living. He has to earn a living by the sweat of his brow, and that there would be thorns that would grow up from the ground. And anytime he was trying to till the soil, thorns and thistles would grow, and it would be a challenge for him. The woman, on the other hand, she would essentially, it seems like that the idea was that children were just given. If she had wanted a child, it would be given. But after this, she would have a menstrual cycle, and she would have pains in labor. And so St. Augustine is looking at all this, and he says, this sounds like it's dealing with a lot of sex. And so when St. Augustine then begins to think about this and formulate this, this idea of the fall, the nudity, the punishment, and then this verse of scripture, in sin I was conceived and in sin I was born. And he begins to realize, I think I know what the original sin is. The original sin is sex. And so St. Augustine's view then is that every person born is born with original sin. As long as there is sexual elements, then that person is born with sin. There's no way around it. Egg, sperm, you can put them in a test tube and do it. You're still born with sin. You can do the usual intercourse. You're going to be born with sin. The sin is not on you. That's not why you're born with original sin. The sin is the fact that your parents have to commit the act, the sex act, in order to conceive you. That then you are born with the taint, if you will, the stain of original sin on your life. And of course, in Christian theology, it is only baptism and belief in Jesus that washes that stain away. But for Augustine, this then begins the idea of original sin. And so it's from this then that it takes hundreds and thousands or 1,000 years for the church to finally make this conclusion. But they began to believe that the natural order, and this is what they teach, and that's why I gave you the Humanae Vitae, the natural order of things is to not have sex unless you want to conceive a child. So contraception is out of the question. Remember that in ethical terms, if you're thinking it as natural theology, which is something that was devised by a Roman Catholic theologian, natural theology says you should not do anything to contravene, to interfere with the natural order of things. And so if the natural order of things is when an egg and a sperm come together, they produce a fetus or a baby, if you will. If that happens, then you should not interrupt that. You should not contravene that in any way. You should not interfere with that in any way. And so the church then, from Augustine, the natural order of things is if you have sex, it better be to have a child. That's why years ago you would see. I'm not going to pick on the Irish or the Italian families or anything like that, but many Italian and Irish families, when they came to the United States, they would have 10, 12 kids. My great grandmother, she had 12 kids. Her husband was an Irish immigrant. And this was what they did. This was not just for entertainment. This was because they believed that contraception was not right. It was against the will of God. Read the article that I put up there from Pope John VI. So anything then. So the norm is if you're going to have sex, it should be for the purpose of procreation, of having children. So then what is then understood as the other part of that norm? Don't have sex. You should not have sex. And so then the idea that sex needs to happen within the bonds of marriage becomes the norm as well. And so premarital sex before marriage, becomes something that is prohibited as well. We know for a fact that in ancient times, even before a couple might be considered married, they would have sex. It was not unusual. But it's as this Christian idea then begins to spread. This also, incidentally, is where the concept and the prize of virginity begins to take prominence. It doesn't matter if the man is a virgin or not. Excuse me. The prize is for the woman to be a virgin at the time she is married. because then it shows that she is pure, she is righteous. Incidentally, this doctrine of original sin, this is going to be an aside. This is not something that you would need to know, but just to finish this out, it's that the doctrine of original sin, as articulated and put forth by Augustine, that then has to do with the idea of the Immaculate Conception. Many people think that the Immaculate Conception has to do with Jesus' birth. It does not. Just to be clear, Immaculate Conception does not have to do with Jesus' birth. Immaculate Conception has to do with Mary's birth. Mary's mother, Anna. So Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, were together, but Anna conceived Mary immaculately. So there was no sexual intercourse there because God needed a pure vessel. And it was believed that women were just the vessel for the child. They didn't know anything about eggs. They only knew that men did something, and when they did that to women, they ejaculated and it went into the woman, and they thought that then the man was placing the tiny little human up in the fertile ground, the seed of the man into the ground. In fact, semen was referred to throughout the Bible and even in later antiquity. Semen was referred to as the man's seed. And so this was then deposited into the woman, the fertile, empty vessel, who their pre-scientific way of thinking had nothing to do with the whole reproductive act. It was just the man, and the woman was the vessel. And so Mary's mother then had to conceive Mary so that she would be born without the taint of original sin. So Mary was born without original sin. She was born immaculately so that she could be the perfect vessel then for the Holy Spirit to overshadow her, Mary, as a young woman, and she would conceive then by the Holy Spirit the Savior of the world, who was to be the sacrifice, Jesus. It's complicated. That has to do with philosophy of religion. That gets into the world religions class. You don't have to know that. I'm simply putting that out there for you to think about. So abstinence becomes the norm, not only for priesthood, but for any couple, for anyone. They should not have sex unless the idea is for them to have a child. And if you do have sex, the idea was that you should be doing it with the expectation that you will have a child. You should not do anything to interfere with that. No contraception. That's why the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has been opposed to condoms. That's why they've been opposed to birth control. Anything like that contravenes, that interferes with the natural order of things. One more piece of that I'll just add, and one of the videos that I sent you talks about this. The other piece is that marriage was not about love. The whole idea that marriage is about love is a very modern concept. It certainly was not the concept for most of human history. We marry for love, but that's only been around for a few hundred years if you look at the vast expanse of things of human history. So that's going to be enough for the lecture today. When I pick up on the next lecture, I will talk some about the history of the sexual revolution and things like that, and then get into the idea of abortion. I'll talk a little bit more about marriage because marriage has two parts to it. Most people think of the religious part. There's a civil part as well, and we'll raise the question about whether civil authorities should be involved or religious authorities should be involved in the whole marriage act itself. So you can email me if you have questions about any of this. You have your discussion questions, you have your lecture, you have your articles, you have the articles in the textbook. And so by next week, I'll be posting a quiz for you to take to show me that you've started this work. All right. Have a good day. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay at home. Don't get out unless you absolutely have to.